Special thanks to Professor John Sherman of the Harvard University Department of Fine Arts for his helpful reading of the text. Italy did not become a unified country until 1870. Until then, and in Michelangelo's time, it was merely a peninsula carved into a number of independent states. Some of them, like Florence, were republics, governed by elected officials. Others, like Naples, were ruled by kings or dukes. The Papal States, whose capital was Rome, was under the control of the Pope. Author's note: if Michelangelo had lived in some other time or some other place, he might never have become an artist. But as fate would have it, he was born in the midst of the greatest flowering of the arts in the history of Europe, an age we call the Renaissance. The name comes from the French word for rebirth, and it refers to a time at the end of the Middle Ages when people began to rediscover the great achievements of their ancient past. This remarkable reawakening of learning and creativity lasted for about 200 years, from the 14th to the 16th centuries. Though the Renaissance spread all over Europe, it was born in Italy, where magnificent Roman ruins were constantly being unearthed in fields and vineyards and at construction sites. The discovery of those ancient buildings, as well as masterpieces of antique sculpture and Greek and Roman writings on science and philosophy, inspired a whole new way of thinking and a whole new kind of art. The very heart of Renaissance art was in Florence. By Michelangelo's time, the city had become a living museum with masterpieces of painting and sculpture almost everywhere you turned, on the walls of churches and monasteries and in the public squares. Though there were talented artists in other places, in Venice and Rome and Siena, for instance, the very greatest came from Florence. The city had already produced Giotto, Donatello, Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, and many, many others. The reputation of Florence as a place where artists grew like wildflowers after a summer rain is demonstrated by the following story, which may or may not be true. A certain young sculptor is said to have created a statue in the Greek style that he then buried in the ground to make it look old. He sold it as an antique to a Roman art dealer, who in turn sold it to a wealthy art collector. When it eventually dawned on the collector that he had been cheated, he hired an agent to find out who the artist might be, not out of anger, but out of curiosity. It seemed to him that anyone who could make a fake that convincing must be every bit as good a sculptor as the ancient Greeks. So where did he tell the agent to begin the search? It was obvious to him that anyone that skilled would have to be from Florence. And, of course, he was right. He traced the statue to Michelangelo, who would one day be judged the very greatest of all the great artists Florence ever produced. He would tower over the last years of the Renaissance, not merely shining in one of the arts, painting, sculpture, or architecture, but mastering all three. Lodovico Buonarroti was a proud man from a respectable old family. He owned a house in Florence and had a little farm in the country. But for the past few generations, things had been going downhill for the Buonarroti family. They weren't exactly poor, but they had to be very careful with their money. And since Lodovico thought himself too refined to do ordinary work, they went on living in genteel poverty, waiting for something to turn up that was sufficiently respectable for a man of his status. Thus Lodovico was greatly pleased when, in 1474, he was offered a temporary post as court magistrate. The job wasn't in Florence, however, but in the little village of Caprese, in a wild and mountainous region 50 miles east of the city. Late in the autumn of that year, he set out on horseback, accompanied by his pregnant wife, Francesca, and their young son, Leonardo. The journey took them several days, winding up steep and twisting roads into the mountains. There they moved into the small stone house provided for visiting magistrates. It was in that house, in the early morning hours of March 6, 1475, that their second son was born. They named him Michelangelo di Lodovico di Leonardo di Buonarroti Simoni. He was to become famous simply as Michelangelo. Stonecutter's tools. Michelangelo did not return to Florence with his family when Lodovico's term of office was over. Instead, his parents left him with a hired nurse in a little country town near their farm. It was a stonecutter's village, and the nurse was a stonecutter's wife. And so it was that the infant Michelangelo fell asleep to the old lullaby of chisel striking stone. Years later he remarked that his love of sculpture must have come to him along with his foster mother's milk. At some point in his baby years, Michelangelo was brought home to Florence. But when he was 6, his mother died, and once again he went to live among the stonecutters. By then he was old enough to try his hand at the hammer and chisel. It is likely that someone gave him lessons in carving stone, for only a few years later, when he first began working as a sculptor's apprentice, he already seemed to know how. Michelangelo was 10 years old when his father, having recently remarried, brought him back to Florence and enrolled him in a grammar school. The education he got there, reading, penmanship, and a bit of Latin, was meant to prepare him for life as a gentleman. But Michelangelo, who spent all of his free time drawing on every scrap of paper he could find, had very different plans for his future. Michelangelo had a neighbor, an older boy named Francesco, who was an artist's apprentice. Seeing that Michelangelo had great talent and a true passion for art, Francesco began bringing home drawings for his friend to study and taking him to visit the workshop of his master, the famous painter Domenico Ghirlandaio. Frieze from a fresco in the church of Santa Maria Novella. When Michelangelo was 13, he asked his father's permission to quit school and become an artist's apprentice like Francesco. Lodovico was outraged. How could Michelangelo, the son of a gentleman, choose such a low occupation? Artists worked with their hands, after all, like common laborers. Lodovico tried beating some sense into the boy, but Michelangelo would not give up. Finally, in April 1488, he was apprenticed to Ghirlandaio for a period of 3 years. Though he was just a beginner, Michelangelo soon found himself working along with Ghirlandaio's other apprentices on the most important commission of their master's career, a cycle of fresco paintings in the church of Santa Maria Novella. The technique for painting in fresco, which means fresh in Italian, is very difficult. It involves applying water-based paint to wet plaster. The two elements are bound together in the drying process so that the colors remain fresh and true even after hundreds of years. But the artist must work fast, and since the plaster usually dries in about 6 hours, depending on the weather, he must do his painting in sections, each small enough to complete in one day. It was the apprentices, of course, who applied the plaster. They also made the brushes and mixed the paints and transferred the outlines of the master's full-sized drawing, called a cartoon, to the wall. This they did by rubbing charcoal dust through tiny holes pricked along the outlines of the cartoon. Only when everything was ready would Ghirlandaio pick up his brush. Even then he painted only the important parts. Everything else, including whole pictures that were too high up on the wall to see very well, was done by his assistants. Michelangelo had only 1 year to learn the art of fresco painting from Ghirlandaio. Then the course of his life was suddenly changed by the most powerful man in Florence. Lorenzo de' Medici, known to all of Florence as Lorenzo the Magnificent, was the heir to an enormous banking fortune. And though he held no government office, Lorenzo ruled Florence from his elegant palace just as his father and grandfather had before him. Of the 3 men, all able rulers, Lorenzo was surely the greatest. He was a brilliant, generous, educated man with the sensitivity of a poet and the instincts of a true statesman. Lorenzo loved art and had a fine collection of Greek and Roman sculptures on display in a private garden. It was a shame, Lorenzo thought as he admired his antiques, that nobody in Florence could make statues like that anymore. Then he had an idea. He would start a special school for sculptors right here in the Medici Gardens. He hired an elderly sculptor named Bertoldo, who had once studied with the great Donatello, to be the master. In rounding up pupils for his new venture, Lorenzo asked Ghirlandaio to recommend a couple of his boys. The 2 he picked were Francesco and Michelangelo. Bertoldo taught his new pupils to make figures in clay, then cast them in bronze. But this technique never interested Michelangelo. He was determined to work in marble as the Greeks and Romans had, even if that meant learning on his own. Judging by the 2 beautiful carvings that he made in those first years, he does not seem to have needed much help. Perhaps it was just as well that Michelangelo worked by himself most of the time, for he didn't have a gift for making friends. He quickly alienated his fellow apprentices with his scornful manner, especially a hot-tempered boy named Torrigiano. On one occasion, Michelangelo made a remark that pushed the boy over the edge. Clenching my fist, Torrigiano recalled later with relish, "I gave him such a punch on the nose that I felt the bone and cartilage crush like a biscuit." Michelangelo hadn't been all that handsome before the fight. Now he was forever after marked with the crumpled nose of a prize fighter. One day, Lorenzo asked Michelangelo to run and fetch his father. It seems that Lorenzo had taken notice of the boy's unusual talent, and wishing to encourage him, had an extraordinary proposal to make. He wanted Michelangelo to move into the palace and live there as his son, to be educated along with the Medici children. He would give the boy an allowance and dress him in fashionable clothes. A purple cloak was mentioned. Lorenzo even offered to find a respectable position for the father. Naturally, Ludovico agreed. And so, at a most impressionable age, Michelangelo was suddenly thrown into the midst of the Medici circle, where poetry, science, philosophy, and art were subjects of dinner-table conversation, and guests included the most famous and brilliant men of the time. It was then that Michelangelo first began writing down his deepest thoughts in the form of poetry, something he would do for the rest of his life. His schoolmates included Lorenzo's three sons, whose varying characters their father once described by saying that the oldest boy, Piero, was foolish, the middle one, Giovanni, was clever, and the youngest, Giuliano, was good. There was another boy living at the palace as well, young Giulio, the son of Lorenzo's beloved brother who had been assassinated by a rival family about 10 years before. When the aristocratic young Medici thought of the sculptor's apprentice, who now shared their schoolroom and was shown such favor, is uncertain. But the fact that these 5 boys should have grown up together is rather stunning, for all but one of them would go on to play significant roles on the world's stage. Both the clever Giovanni and his cousin Giulio would someday rise to the supreme position in the Catholic Church as Popes Leo X and Clement VII. Foolish Piero would succeed his father as ruler of Florence, though disastrously. And then, of course, there was Michelangelo, who would surpass them all. He would one day be regarded as the greatest artist of all time. In April 1492, just a few months before his fellow Italian Christopher Columbus set sail from Spain and found a new world, Lorenzo de' Medici died. What caused his death is unclear, but he was probably not helped by the medicine his doctor gave him, a potion of crushed pearls and precious gems. The following morning the unfortunate doctor was discovered lying at the bottom of a well. Michelangelo, deeply saddened by Lorenzo's death, moved back into his father's house. He was rather at loose ends at that point, for he was no longer an apprentice and had no desire to set up a workshop of his own. But he did need to bring in money for the family, especially since his older brother Leonardo had become a monk and could no longer help out financially. As the second oldest son, Michelangelo became the breadwinner for his father and 2 younger brothers, a role he would play for the rest of his life. He began to work on his first large sculpture, a figure of Hercules, which he eventually sold to a wealthy Florentine family. Michelangelo chose to portray his Hercules as the ancient Greeks and Romans had, in the nude. Michelangelo did not find the naked body in the least embarrassing, for he had been taught that man was created in the image of God. It was the human form, in fact, that most interested Michelangelo as an artist. To understand his subject better, Michelangelo went to the hospital of Santo Spirito and got permission to study anatomy in the morgue. He spent hours there dissecting bodies, memorizing the origins and insertions of the muscles, the positions of tendons and veins. It was a gruesome exercise, taking apart the dead to discover their secrets. But it was there that he gained his astonishing power to bring forth life from a block of stone. Upon the death of Lorenzo de' Medici, his son Piero came to power. Unfortunately for Florence, he proved to be as brash and arrogant and incompetent as his father had been measured, modest, and wise. Piero managed to offend just about everybody, had a knack for making bad decisions, and was completely unfit to cope with the serious problems that Florence now faced. His most memorable act as a patron of the arts was typical for its frivolity. On the occasion of an unusually heavy snowfall, he summoned Michelangelo to the palace to make a snowman. The people of Florence began calling him Piero the Unfortunate and muttering under their breath about revolution. When the city fathers actually barred the council doors against him, it dawned on Piero that he had lost his position as first citizen and soon might lose his life. He hurried away from Florence by night, and on the following day mobs looted the palace. Michelangelo was not there to see the tragic end of the 60-year Medici rule. Afraid that his own association with the family might put him in danger, he had already left the city. He first went to Venice, then to Bologna, where he stayed for more than a year. When Michelangelo returned to Florence, he found things greatly changed. The city had fallen under the spell of a fire-breathing religious extremist, the monk Savonarola. His doomsday sermons had reduced the people to a state of terror, alarm, sobbing, and tears. The luxurious, loving citizens of Florence were so desperate to save their souls that they brought out their most prized belongings, rich brocades, ornaments, antique books, works of art, and heaped them up in the public square to be burned. This was called the bonfires of the vanities, Savonarola. With the people of Florence busy seeking salvation by burning their beautiful things, there was little for artists to do. So once again Michelangelo left the city, this time heading south for Rome. and it was there, only 2 years later, that he met the man who would make him famous. This was an elderly French cardinal, soon to retire and return to France. He had lived for many years in Rome and had come to love it. He yearned to leave behind some beautiful monument in honor of the time he spent there. Michelangelo came highly recommended, so the cardinal commissioned him to make a marble sculpture of the Virgin Mary holding the dead Christ in her arms. Such a scene is called Pietà, which means pity in Italian. According to the contract he signed, Michelangelo was supposed to finish the sculpture in a year, but it took him 2. By then the Frenchman had died, never to know what an amazing gift he had given the world. For when Michelangelo had finally chiseled every last fold of the Virgin's robe, rendered the reins and tendons in Jesus' hands so that they looked more real than real, and polished the marble to a high finish, the people of Rome were stupefied. Not since the time of the ancient Greeks had there been a sculptor with such amazing skill, and he was only 25 years old. It was the Holy Year, 1500, the end of the century. Pilgrims from all over Europe flocked to Rome where they heard about the astonishing new Pietà. Though some people remarked that Mary looked awfully young to be the mother of a grown man, the sculpture won almost unanimous praise. Thus Michelangelo was annoyed when he overheard a man informing the admiring crowd that the Pietà was the work of a certain artist from Milan. The next night Michelangelo returned to the chapel with his tools. On the band that runs diagonally across the Virgin's chest, in beautiful Roman letters, he carved his name. Michelangelo Buonarroti from Florence made this. During the years he was in Rome, Michelangelo's friends wrote to him with news from Florence. Things were changing for the better, they told him. Savonarola was gone, having made the fatal mistake of charging the Pope with corruption. The Pope had struck back, accusing Savonarola of heresy, for which charge the monk was executed in the public square on the very spot where he had once held his bonfires of the vanities. The people of Florence, no longer under the dictatorship of the Medici or the madman, were free to govern themselves. That was good news for artists. The newly elected governor was eager to commission great works of art to glorify the city. One of those projects involved an enormous block of marble, affectionately named the Giant, which had been sitting in the work-yard of the Cathedral of Florence for over 30 years. It had been abandoned by an earlier sculptor who had blocked it out poorly, and since that time no one had known what to do with it. Now the city fathers were hoping to find a sculptor who could make something beautiful out of the misshapen block. Michelangelo knew he was the man they were looking for. He returned to Florence and went before the cathedral board with his proposal. He probably showed them a drawing or a small clay model so they could see what his sculpture would look like. They were evidently impressed because a short time later they announced that the giant was his. A shed was built around the great block so he could work in privacy, and on September 13, 1501, he began. Michelangelo had chosen the perfect subject to show off his remarkable skills, the young David, in a monument of intense concentration, about to do battle with Goliath. He stands, resting on one leg, the other bent slightly. It is a pose out of ancient Greek sculpture, natural and graceful. Michelangelo knew his anatomy so well that his David is astonishingly real, except that he is 17 feet high and blessed with godlike beauty. This, of course, was exactly what Michelangelo intended. David's physical perfection was merely the outward sign of his inner state of grace. Michelangelo was already famous for his Pietà. The David established him as the greatest sculptor in all of Italy. Success has its price. From that time on, Michelangelo would be hounded by patrons. Such superhuman labors would be required of him that he would later write, "Painting and sculpture have ruined me. It would have been better if in my youth I had hired myself out to make sulphur matches." He was now asked to make 12 larger-than-life apostles for the cathedral to be delivered at a rate of 1 a year. That was in addition to several projects he had already taken on. With enough work to keep him busy for a good 15 years, Michelangelo now accepted yet another major commission, to paint an enormous mural on one wall of the new council chamber. This was rather out of his line, for though artists in those days were expected to be skilled in every branch of the arts, he considered himself a sculptor. What little he knew of painting in fresco he had learned in that single year of apprenticeship with Ghirlandaio 15 years before. But how could he turn the job down? Not only was it a tremendous honor to be chosen, but there was also the matter of the other wall, which was to be painted by the only man in Italy to rival him in fame, a man he both envied and disliked, Leonardo da Vinci. It was well known that Leonardo considered sculpture, which was messy and noisy, to be inferior to painting, which he thought more refined. It would be a real pleasure to beat the old man at his own game. The people of Florence called it the Battle of the Titans and waited with breathless excitement to see what the artists would do. The council had asked them to depict military victories from the history of Florence, so Leonardo, who drew horses beautifully, chose a cavalry charge. Michelangelo was best at the human figure, so he picked a scene in which a group of Florentine soldiers had been surprised while bathing in the river. Leonardo da Vinci. People traveled from all over Italy just to look at the beautiful cartoons. But today, if you go to Florence and enter the council chamber, you will not find any paintings by Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo. Though Leonardo got as far as the painting stage, he used an untried new technique in place of the traditional fresco, and it failed. Eventually, the picture was painted over. Michelangelo never even got that far before he was called back to Rome by the Pope, Julius II. Julius was a bold and ambitious man. What he wanted from Michelangelo was a monumental tomb, something that would carry his memory on through the ages. Michelangelo, who also tended to think big, sketched a colossal freestanding monument of marble more than 36 feet high, holding 40 statues, all of them larger than life. Julius loved it, but he couldn't imagine where he could put such a thing. It would have to go in a very large church indeed. This set him to thinking of tearing down the old St. Peter's, the great mother church of the Catholic faith, built by the Emperor Constantine more than 1,000 years before. He would replace it with a new St. Peter's, one so big and so splendid it would be the marvel of the world.